name's Luke Townsend. I work for the City of Cape Town Library Service, and I'm here in Wynberg with renowned piano player Andrew Lilley, who's a teacher, a musician, an author, and very well known in the jazz fraternity and one of the top jazz musicians in Cape Town and South Africa, a renowned pianist. Andrew, what is your full name and when were you born?
My full name is Andrew Christopher Pritchard Lilley, and I was born on the 7th of September 1962.
What kind of extraction were your parents?
My mom was born in Swaziland, and my dad was born in Cornwall, and he was a Brit.
When did he come to South Africa?
Well, he came to South Africa after World War II because he fought in the worst parts of the Asian Pacific, in Okinawa, and they used to stop at Cape Town. He became familiar with Cape Town in the 40s when he was in Cape Town, and there were jazz gigs and there were things that he could play, and then eventually he got a job in the very first sort of incarnation of the symphony orchestra.
So he was a musician?
Trumpet player. There's a very strong tradition of brass playing in the UK, so he got a really good foundation and probably some really good teachers in the military bands, in the Royal Marine Band. But then and he was gigging a lot in London, actually.
Wow.
In his late teens, playing in jazz gigs. I mean, he was a really good busker in that style. I mean, I was amazed even when he was in his 80s and he'd kind of stopped playing. He could still pick up the trumpet and cut a chorus in the style of Armstrong and that sort of, the swing, not Dixieland, but swing. The phrases and everything. He had something happening there.
Yeah. Did he meet your mother through music as well?
Yeah, he met my mom. She was from Swaziland, so she expressed interest in doing music, and her mother and father sent her to the College of Music here in Cape Town. And she was standing in the queue one day, and the person in front of her was studying harp, and she decided, for some reason, some shining light came down to her, and she just said, I'm going to want to do harp. So she finished at college, and then there was a job that came up in the symphony orchestra, because harp's a very unusual instrument, I suppose, in that you've only got one of them in the orchestra, maximum two. And she did the audition and everything, and she didn't get it. She actually went to study in the Royal College of Music in London. Then she applied from London, exactly the same application, in the same year, and she got it.
And what was that job?
It was the principal harpist of the Cape Town Symphony Orchestra.
Okay.
So now we're talking about like 1956, 57. She would have met my dad then.
And your mother is?
Doma.
What is his name?
Roy Lilley. Ultimately became the principal trumpet for many years in the symphony orchestra.
So how would you describe your community that you grew up in?
As a child, I grew up around symphony orchestra musicians because my parents were in that. So everybody that was at my house and all their kids were all children of symphony players. So that was what I knew, basically about music. Everything was ordered around that.
When did you start playing music?
Obviously you're surrounded by music. My parents, made sure that I had proper instruction, classical instruction, found good teachers, and they made sure that I had that opportunity to explore whether I had talent or be a musician. I had the opportunity because I was surrounded by musicians, so I was already playing at 6. I was largely classical, but I had an interest in playing other forms of music. So even I remember in the 70s, interested in playing sort of tunes off the radio and stuff like learning Billy Joel tunes and learning tunes that I'd heard on the radio. I did grades, all the various grades and stuff, and then during that time my brother had actually started a sort of barn dance band.
What's his name?
Patrick. So we used to play in the barn dances, and as kids your parents always want to find some safe place for you to not get into trouble, and in those days the church was quite a good option, so they would always drop us off as kids at the Salvation Army. And so then that opportunity of playing in that barn dance thing, because that's my brother.
So was it country music?
I guess you could say so, yeah.
Square dances?
Yeah, square dances. So I would be playing the piano, which is just repetitive, sort of playing over and over again the same bit. But in that repetitiveness, you sort of maybe develop a kind of a looseness or sense of improvisation. And we had a bass player and a drummer.
And then after school?
Well, after school, then the army had kicked in, so then they were looking for us. And then my brother had managed to find his way into a Jewish camp in Kimberley, because he was actually also a good actor, and he pretended to be Jewish. And my brother said, look, I'm Jewish. I'm in a safe place here. If you're going to come now, you must come now, because I can organize that you come to this camp, because obviously you're also going to be Jewish. And then you might not have that opportunity. So he had a band there, and he was which could have been anything from Burumisic to whatever was on the radio for people to dance. It was a way of getting out of combat. So by then I was just interested, sort of not sure kind of musically what was going on, but I was still playing classical music. But when I went to the army, that was taken away from me. So I didn't have opportunity to practice and have a piano, to do my rigorous classical. There was no monitoring then in the army. So I kind of lost balance there, and I just would find a piano. And then my interests started to take effect. And by then I'd already heard people like Chick Corea and stuff like that. And I started to get less interested in Billy Joel and more interested in Chick Corea. And then I was trying to source his music and play his tunes. And
Are there specific musicians who are important?
Well, Chick Corea was like, I guess, an easy one, because he managed to bridge the gap between the classical and jazz, because he had a strong classical background, as well as the music that he was playing was quite Spanish flamenco style, which could be seen as performance music. So you could literally learn a song of his and perform it, and it would have integrity. So, but at one point, I do distinctly remember my brother bringing home an album with Herbie Hancock on it, and it was a Miles Davis recording called My Funny Valentine. I knew that sound was what was getting me, because I picked up bits of the blues element in, when you're a kid listening to Earth, Wind and Fire and stuff, and they'd have a little bit of improvisation and soul music. I sort of started liking that music more than pop music, and then I found the bits that I liked about soul music were where there was a solo, where you'd hear like a tune like Street Life, but then I can't remember who the pianist is on that. Joe Sample. You'd hear Joe Sample take a solo, and I think I quite like that, and so I sort of became more interested in that aspect of it, and so curious. So when I heard Herbie Hancock, that was like listening to advanced Joe Sample, but extremely like very advanced. This is early 80s.
So that was the time of George Benson,
yes.
the Crusaders,
and
which was already, was that because growing up in Cape Town you were being exposed to that music was so...
Yeah, and to backtrack, the girlfriend that I was dating was Lisa Garson, and her parents were also from a musical family, and she was quite ahead of her time. She'd sort of introduced me to stuff, but girlfriend and boyfriend at the age of 16 and 17, we used to steal my parents' car and drive out to Philippi and to those areas which were sort of no-go areas to go and watch Jonathan Butler and the Rockets and the Schilder Brothers and whomever was playing, because that music was the nicest music. And we used to go to a club in Claremont called the Kraal, which was mixed. Everything was mixed. There was a kind of an underground world where just people were doing stuff and just enjoying each other for what they were, and the commonality of things that they enjoyed together. There was no sort of racial... So I don't know how we did it, but we would just drive out into those areas and, drive a car and end up in a car with people busting pipes, and it wasn't what I would call safe options, but I think because the fact that we had taken that chance was sort of respected, and I never felt like I was unsafe. Lisa, again, said to me, there's this guy called Merton Barrow. I had no idea that these guys existed, and she found Merton Barrow. You've got to watch Merton. I went to see Merton Barrow. And Merton was a sort of a undercover icon, so he ran that jazz workshop. Yeah. And when I discovered that, I actually found a mentor, somebody who had knowledge, who had an understanding, who had a history, who could nurture and had a very welcoming spirit. And so I ended up going to the jazz workshop, and it uncovered and I ended up going there. I remember the first person I ever encountered was Mike Perry, and he was like really good. He would have come from Merton, so he just I would have been 17, 18, 19.
This would be 1979 to 81 or something like that. When did you start playing gigs?
Well, by then I started playing gigs. Once I was out of the army and back in Cape Town, then avenues for doing things sort of spun off from the jazz workshop, and then you get involved in sort of mostly playing, whatever, sort of pop music and stuff. And like one thing would sort of lead to another. And just you get into the gigging scene, and then you start to meet other people. I met Dave Ledbetter there.
Yeah, okay.
I met James Schofield, the guitarist, there. And you start building a sort of a community, which is what you need, of other musicians who are also attached to other things and possibly to other gigs. And so you sort of would get pulled into a scene, and if you were of any use, somebody would book you.
At what stage did you go to Berkeley?
Yeah, when I came out of the army, I was looking for some way to. Then you're a young adult, and you have responsibility, and the army has already chowed 3 years of your brain and time. So I went and did architecture, and I got into the architectural school. And I did 3 years of architecture, during which time I was gigging a lot more. It was like the late 80s. And a friend of mine he had a friend at architectural school. His name was Gary Finberg, and he was a guitarist. And he used to visit this guy because he was at Berkeley. It was affordable, and I heard that he was at Berkeley, and architectural school, I would have pursued it. But in my gap year, I said to my mom, I want to get out of this place, because the moment we had a gap year, the first thing I got was a call-up. So I said, I can't bear this. I need to get out of here. And so she sent me to Berkeley, and I got into Berkeley. I auditioned, and I got into Berkeley. And but Gary let me stay in his flat while I got my feet together, and I made friends there. And Nick LaRue was there with me, and I met him. Actually, I was in an ensemble there one day at Berkeley. There was this guy in the corner sitting very on his own there with a saxophone. I remember we played some tunes or whatever, and the teacher, and then I heard this guy speak, and I was like, "You're South African," and everything. And it was Nick LaRue, and he was like. So then I hooked up with Nick, and we had a great time at Berkeley together. We actually lived in an apartment together, and we did crazy things. And, I studied with some good musicians way ahead. I think I was too young to go to Berkeley. I don't think I knew enough. I certainly didn't know what my students know now when they go there. The first guy I ever studied with was a guy called Donald Brown. He was a pianist with Art Blakey, which was like walking into a room with jazz god.
Yeah.
And he'd written a few tunes which were really directed at apartheid situation. So he knew I was from South Africa and I was white. I never got a bad vibe from him ever. He was super nice. He was nurturing, and wow, what an amazing guy. Also a guy called Bruce Barth, who was a protege of Donald Brown and used to often dip for him when Donald Brown couldn't do gigs. And he was very nurturing, very good, and he ended up being a very good player in New York. Also studied with Ray Santisi, who is an icon, who taught people like Keith Jarrett, or at least Keith Jarrett passed under his sort of tutorship. He said, when I asked him what was it like teaching Keith Jarrett, he said to me, "Oh, talented kid." And I was like, it was, and I was actually studying music synthesis because I thought that would, it was the fusion period. I was into that, so I was studying music synthesis, programming synths, and that whole thing. Sampling had just begun, and it was cutting edge, but basically everything that I got taught at Berkeley and every studio that I'd ever encountered or was in, you could basically do all of that stuff on your iPhone now. It was the beginning of a world which has now been reduced to a single iPhone.
Yeah.
That study is, I think, what got me into the university when I came back.
So when did you come back?
Going back in time, when I was sort of still going into the dangerous areas looking for inspiring music, I had encountered Winston Mancuku. And I think Mike Perry used to play with him at the Jazz Workshop, probably said to me, "Oh, come and watch my gig. I'm playing at the Sun Hotel with Winston Mancuku." And he was playing a sound that I wasn't really familiar with, but it was basically Coltrane. And I think Mike Perry was sort of his facilitator. One evening I went to go and watch Winston at the Sun Hotel in Strand Street, and there was a young guy playing electric bass, and the bass player was very good, and he could improvise. And I realized, I like this. Whatever's going on here, I must have asked somebody, who is that? Who's the piano player? Who's the bass player? And I said to me, no, that's Mike Campbell. And so I sort of followed him around a bit. But anyway, when I came back from Berkeley, 89, yeah. So going back in time, Richard Pickett was involved in the Jazz Workshop, the drummer, and he used to play a lot with Mike and Winston, and he used to play a lot with the Shoulders, and Jonathan Butler, a really good drummer. And Richard Pickett asked Merton Barrow, who can I get to dip for Tony Schilder? I mean, you'd think there'd be hundreds of people that could play that night. But for some reason, Merton said, well, you can get this young kid, Andrew Lilley, he can do it. And I ended up playing in this club, dipping for Tony, one night with Richard Pickett playing. I mean, it was such a weird, but Richard was so cool and everything. And then at one point, Richard and Campbell came back from America. He started a band called Pound Seats. And it was like a sort of a fusion band, and Richard was they were looking for a pianist, and they tried to get Merton Barrow to play, and Merton said no, he didn't want to play, but he'd recommended this kid. And then I ended up in a garage in Hart Bay auditioning for Campbell. And I guess the fact that I could read and just play, for Campbell being a professional musician was such a dream come true that he could actually write charts and they would be played and learned, that he just took me on. And so I ended up playing in this band, Pound Seats. And then I think the fact that I'd gone to Berkeley and the band sort of broke up. When I came back, I had established a relationship with Campbell. And by then he had taken a job up at UCT, teaching. They needed another position because he was completely oversubscribed. And so I ended up going back to the college, coming back from Berkeley on the request of Campbell to come and help him teach contemporary music practice, which was synthesizers, and because it was a fusion period. So I came back, and 1990. Well, then I went back to Berkeley, finished my studies, and then I did some naughty things for a bit, and then I came back again.
That would have been now 1991.
Yes.
And then did you immediately start working at the university?
Well, no, then a permanent job came up. And Campbell wrote to me and he said to me, you should apply for this position. I think the fact that Campbell was from North State, Texas, and had been through a jazz kind of study sort of structure, and the fact that I'd been in Berkeley and had gone through a study structural, kind of program, as well as having specific focus in music synthesis, because that position that came up was to teach contemporary music practice and theory, and I had the qualifications for it, which probably nobody else had then. And I got the gig, and I liked it, And then South Africa seemed like a good place to be at the time.
So you worked at UCT since?
Well, since 1992, and then 1 year before that in 1989.
Yeah. Okay.
So I've been there for 30 years or whatever.
Yeah.
Because nobody else wants them. I ended up, now I'm the director of the College of Music, which is kind of starting this year, which is going to be interesting. But
2023.
2023.
So was the music industry relatively, do you think it was in a relatively healthy state?
If I like analogies, but if you can imagine, the community was positioned in a particular way before that, in an unhealthy environment, but collectively were quite healthy. The musicians themselves, there seemed to be no problem with Mike Perry playing with Winston Mankuku, and there seemed to be no problem with it. There seemed to be a community, and all I can say is that at that point, somebody came and took a jug of water and pouring it on a stable kind of corridor of ants. It just got scattered, We were all still there, but when it came back together, in a unhealthy way.
Okay.
Because then the politics kicked in.
Yeah.
And then it was like bean counting. You can't play on this stage because this is funded by the Dutch, and the Dutch and then it just got polarized, and government kicked in, and it just got ugly, and then so Universal Records, BMI, Sony, all of those companies came into South Africa, and the first thing they looked for was to suck up artists. But instead of looking at established artists that might have been there already, people like Winston Mankuku, or even like established white players, or even they picked up all the new young black African players, and they just whipped up every single graduate from the College of Music program and gave them top recording contracts, and just jettisoned them up to the top. And then you had this entire hierarchy of wealthy recording artist musicians that had gone from zero to hero in a matter of 2 months, and their shadow was just cast on an entire underground world that had existed before them that was no longer visible.
And did that also have an effect on the style of music that was being performed?
Yes. That popular sort of what's now become sort of smooth jazz is what I guess Universal and Sony were pushing. Now I think a lot of those artists are finding their sort of African root. You see a lot of stuff, but it's taken a long time.
After when you came back and you were gigging, where would you be playing, and with which musicians were you playing with at that stage?
There were. I mean, really, I was busy gigging, but it was literally everything from playing, the Grahamstown Festival, doing show music, to playing for musical theatre, playing for shows, playing for gigs, playing sort of crossover music.
But with who? Which musicians?
Well, now you see,
people like Kevin
Gibson. I was often playing, Gibson or Barry Van Zyl or those kind of people were often playing. But I also had played with a lot of the funk bands. Daryl Andrews I was playing with in the clubs like Montreal is the club I was talking about, and also the Galaxy and places like that. So I played a lot with Daryl.
But were
regular
there any
gigs.
musicians that you had a particular connection with?
Yes, Tina Scow, I would say, was somebody that I had a strong connection with, and we used to do a lot of gigs together, and I met a lot of people through her, like people like Dave Ledbetter and Basil Moses and Kevin Gibson. When I met Kevin, I immediately realized, okay, this guy is different from the rest of the bunch. He plays a lot better than everybody else. So I thought that I'd like to carry on playing with this guy, because this feels right, because every time I played with him I'd feel good. So I thought, okay, there's something that I need this guy around, like a cup of coffee, and there were a lot of regular gigs, like the Green Dolphin was a regular gig, and I was playing there regularly. I also met Bruce Cassidy, who's a massive mentor for me around that time, and I think we used to go, and James Schofield and myself used to go and watch him play at the Oyster Bar. Bruce Cassidy, when I saw him play trumpet, I think I used to go and watch Noel Klinkhammer. They used to play at the Fairmead Hotel. I enjoyed watching them, but one day I went there and there was this bald guy playing trumpet. This guy, I realized this guy was like shredding on another level. Like he could play, his fingers were moving, there was scale, there was density in his line, and it was Bruce Cassidy, and I recognized him from years before at the Three Arts. I'd seen him there with that Blood, Sweat and Tears. So I just used to follow him around, and then he started a band at the Oyster Bar with not very good players, rock players, but he instructed them exactly what to play. But I met Bruce, and then I don't know how I got hooked up. I ended up doing some gigs with Bruce, and then different gigs I played with in Joburg. And then when I came back from Berkeley, at one point he said, "Do you want to do some movie scores?" And I hooked up with him writing movie scores, and so I got involved with Bruce quite a bit. And he had a gigging scene. So it seems like there were a lot of gigs going on, and I was involved in a lot of shit all at the same time.
You had bands later?
Well, I played in bands like Pound Seats, and but I hadn't generated own bands. But I think that we had people that we were always playing with, but I hadn't necessarily generated an identity of playing a particular kind of music.
But you made recordings?
Yes, I did, because I ended up playing with a lot of people.
So, but you made them under your own name, or it was
only later, only post 2000, when I'd met Gavin Minter. He's a real entrepreneur, because he doesn't really have anything. He doesn't have any privilege, put it that way, to use a woke word. So he often would push me to doing things. I think before then I had started doing fusion stuff, and I was into, and there's a couple of clips on YouTube of us doing gigs at the College of Music, of playing original fusion music, hardcore fusion music. I did something with SABC, offered opportunity. So there's recordings lying around of bits and pieces. And I got a few mixes out of it, but never managed to complete that project because it was just impossible. There was no money to do that level of... You couldn't do it at home. You couldn't do that kind of thing then. You had to pay money for that. So I had made attempts to do recordings, some of which you can find online, of fusion stuff that I did. You know, I met people like Dave O'Higgins, who was a sax player from the UK, and I'd end up playing at the Green Dolphin or playing in Grahamstown with him. So then I would start writing music for that.
Yeah.
So, you know, those tunes like Ukavuyo, and they came out of that first
so
project with O'Higgins.
That was in 2004, you said?
Yeah, or 2001 I think that came out.
So that's your first solo recording?
Yeah. And then sort of 2009, I was then doing a lot of gigs in Grahamstown. In fact, we had a strong... Campbell and myself were basically the starting point, along with Doris Brubeck, of the Grahamstown Jazz School project that aligned with the festival then. Now it's become completely massive and it's very political, and now I think it's on the wane now. But there I met the Swedes, because we always used to bring international players, and the Swedes are real jazz players. They're like jazz cats, and I met a lot of them there. And then again, Gavin came along and he said, listen, I've got a project with a big band with myself singing, and I'm getting this guy to write arrangements. They're coming down to Cape Town. Don't you want to add on, you know, I'd write some songs, you know, I'd write some tunes, and then next minute I'd be in the studio with like Frederick Norren and Johan Holland and
these are the Swedish.
Yeah, and the Swedish players. I'd get Gibson to play, because they didn't have a drummer, but I liked working with Gibson, and then Martin Shosted.
You and Kevin and
Martin Shosted on bass.
Because it's a sextet.
Yes, and Carl Martin on tenor, and Johan Holland on alto, and Frederick Norren on trumpet. So then I'd write 3 horn charts. And then I realized who I was writing for. I could actually write intervals, you know, like players that were standing next to you playing a whole step apart. Because before that, any attempts to write horn parts in the Cape Town setting, not to kind of discredit it, but I guess nobody really was familiar with doing that kind of level of playing continuously.
Yeah.
It wasn't an issue for them, and suddenly I was like, wow, these guys can play this stuff. So then I was starting to write interesting harmonies.
Did you ever manage to do gigs with them?
Yeah, I did a lot of gigs with them, and then I even
went in Cape Town or
in Cape Town. We played at and internationally we played at. They were interesting people and highly proficient. So we'd do gigs a lot at the Green Dolphin. I played gigs at the Mahogany Room, which was the club that started there, then became Straight No Chaser, and I'd do various gigs. Played at the Nassau Centre.
And internationally.
And then Gavin, again, being central to a lot of operations, organised a tour playing his quintet music that he got an arranger to write, which was like the American Songbook.
Yeah.
And then the stuff that I had written. So we went to Sweden and did a tour just playing one set of my music, one set of his music. And so I managed to do gigs in Germany, free, with no problem, through James Schofield. And then I did a tour...
Playing his stuff? Or
no, just playing gigs. You know. And then a tour with Melanie Skoltz, which was through the, you know, Croatia, Serbia.
All the Yugoslavian.
The Yugoslavian. Balkan sort of. I did a tour with Melanie there.
And now you've got Ukavuyo, and then what is the other one?
The other one's called Brother Gone. Yeah.
That was Brother Gone.
Yeah.
2018.
Yes.
And then now you about to release.
Now I did a solo piano album, which sort of came out of nowhere, because I took a year off, which I was entitled to. I started trying out different things. I got a nice piano at home. I started trying some things out, and in the process of trying, I set up some mics in my room. But then one day I just sort of played a tune, one of my tunes, as an explorative kind of thing, and I sent it to my girlfriend who's in New York, and she listened to it and she said to me, "But this is so nice. Just do a solo album." And I was like, okay. And then I did an album in an entire week. In 1 week, I recorded like 12 tracks until I sort of exhausted my output. So that's what I've done now, and I've recorded that album now, and I like it, and I'm proud of it.
Okay, but now you're a published author, so you've written 2 published books.
Yeah. So the first one, Jazz Style, I published because being published will perish at UCT, you know. So publish or perish. So I sort of trying to get a publishing deal is almost literally impossible. Yeah. So I just self-published the first book so that I could also give it to my students and help. But it also it comes with an ISBN number, and it's, you know. So I published that. It was basically sort of an introduction to students to say, listen, man, you need ear training, you need these things, but you need to not do the wrong thing. You need to do the right thing. This is the tradition. This is where it comes from, and these are the avenues that you should explore. So it's not instructional, it's more directional. I wish I'd had a book like that when I was a kid, because it would have been just a very short little book that just said to me, this is where it's at, now you can go and find that information, because there's a lot of rubbish out there. And so I published that, and then further down the channel I realized, okay, and I love Becky Mseleku's music. The students were crying out for information, and they were saying, why are we always studying, you know, Charlie Parker's solos? Why are we always studying John Coltrane? Not that you shouldn't, bearing in mind that Becky also studied them. But I sort of tried to position some academic, analytical work around a player that I consider to be a serious competitor in the jazz world fraternity. You know, like the music of Becky Mseleku is unusual, but it's also powerful, but in my opinion is on the same level as the people that the kids are studying, you know. So it's an inroad to say to the kids, hey, here's some music which belongs to your own heritage that you can get into, that'll take you to another world, which is the world that you actually want to be in, because it's a language, and that language has origins, and the origins are African American, whichever way you try and spin it. But it's able to be so diverse in respect of its expression that you'll find the language is expressed uniquely through the lens of a Zulu speaking Durban born, you know, South African. Yeah. But on a very high level, because he's exceptionally talented, and he just somehow, he's a genius, you know. Yeah. Another thing that you've done is instructional videos. Is it something that you had to keep doing when the pandemic actually... Yeah, because the pandemic basically shut down any avenues for face-to-face musical instruction, which is basically the way music is taught. So But had you kind of foreseen the necessity for doing that? Well, I you know, like kids would always now with iPhones and, you know, various other things, they were always arriving at their lesson, and very often they would just say, "Prof, can't you just play that on the piano?" And then they'd film me playing it, you know. Or I'd say, "Listen, it's easy if I just explain it to you, just film it," you know. And then so I thought, okay, that's a good way to help. But I was happy with it in that domain. I said, I don't care if you share. Like sometimes I'd arrive at a class, honestly, to be honest, and the kids would not pitch for the class, and they'd just leave their iPhone with their friend, and they would put it on a music stand facing me. So sometimes I'd look at a class, and there'd be 3 people in the class and 4 music stands staring at me with iPhones. But then I got concerned because, you know, the woke kicked in, and there were some negatives. And then I used to say to students, you actually can't do it unless I know it. Because if I said something, you know, wrong, if I use 2 words in the wrong way, and somebody decided to share it with somebody else, and the next minute I'm a toxic. But so then I thought I can produce some video material that would be sanctioned by me, where I just talk about stuff and it's edited, and I got Final Cut Pro, and I started working on that, and I got quite good at it, and eventually and then COVID hit, and then I realized, okay, so I did a course at Berkeley, actually, an online music course, to see how they ran it. It was with Gary Burton, and I thought, okay, you can do this, and produced basically 2 years worth of study material for theory and experiment. I could actually make an online course like that.
you see that kind of approach to music as being the future of music, or do you think is the live experience actually still the
well,
most valuable?
I mean, the live experience is the most valuable. There's no question about it, because of the energy of human interaction, the electricity between humans. And I know I'm right, because when I go to New York and I sit in a little gig at Mesro and I'm watching a band playing, I find myself being elevated to a level of enthusiasm and happiness which I just don't encounter, listening to music, even though I can enjoy it. I listen to McCoy Tyner or something, and I love the recording and I listen to it, but then I'm listening to some analytical perspective. When you're lost in a tiny little club underground somewhere in New York, having queued for an hour and a half, and you're watching Ravi Coltrane play with some strange Israeli pianist with no bass player and a drummer who plays his ass off, and like you just like you've never heard anything like this. You just find yourself being elevated and so excited. And I realized that is what live music can never be replaced, and because it's so incredibly powerful, it will never be replaced. Everyone will always know that. It cannot. There is no virtual world which can replace the real world of interaction, even though it's fun and it's interesting. But I think the online world will always be with us as a form of, a quick fix. It has its downsides, because you'll find kids are not focused on one player, but they flick through a bit of that, I like that, I flick through a bit of this, bit of that, and they're not really getting a wholesome, focused experience that would result in a focused orientation. So, so I think that world will eventually close down. You can already see with Elon Musk buying up Twitter that it's starting to lose its traction, and people are not sure if they really want to get their news from Twitter anymore. They're starting, maybe it's better to buy the Mail and Guardian. So I honestly think books are here to stay, live music, and in fact I think that there will be more of a return to that. The online world will be an item that is on the shelf, but along with the physical and along with everything else. It won't be taking over and replacing. It'll just be another option online. It'll be another option on the shelf. And with records, space. I mean, it's the experience of the actual experience. And so now you find an entire industry has grown up around that. The supply of needles, the supply of turntables. What kind of turntable, what kind of amp, cleaning of the records. How do you clean records? In fact, more around the rigorous sort of support industries than we ever had as starting with. The record player was just a place to play music. And it has returned as a legitimate medium, because it is actually a better medium in a lot of respects. If you really want to get the experience of listening to it, then you need to go and get the medium to hear it through properly, to enjoy it. And the best medium is to go and watch the symphony orchestra, or to go and watch a live gig if you can. The ultimate medium. But if you want that experience, buy a turntable and start buying vinyl.
Okay, Andrew, thanks, man.
No, it was nice. I enjoyed the discussion. Opened up a lot of